So, good morning, everybody. As Annabelle said, we're going to be carrying on the series looking at Amos. In a minute, we're going to read from Amos chapter 5, verses 1 to 13. So, I don't know if, Kat, you've got that on the screen, or Judy, you might need to go and do some emergency coaching on how to add that, or Theo. But don't worry about that. Last week, it was really nice to have the Dallies with us. And a bit of light relief from the book of Amos, but we're back to it today. We're into chapter 5, and we're going to divide this chapter into two parts. So we're only looking at the first 13 verses today, and it's titled A Lament and Call to Repentance. So a cheery title, but actually as we go through, I think there's a link to the fact that it is Pentecost today. And what we remember about that time when the Spirit fell on the disciples, when they were there waiting and praying for this gift that Jesus said he was going to send. But before we read the passage, I just wanted to share kind of rant about two things that really bug me. And there is a link to this, but I think now I'm in my mid-40s, I'm becoming more and more annoyed by various things. The first one is about the way in this country we now use the poppy. So when I was growing up, we had the Festival of Remembrance around November and Armistice Day, and I thought that was a really significant thing. When I was a kid, not lots of people won't know this, but I was in the Boys Brigade. And I was in the marching band, and every Remembrance Sunday, we would lead the parade for a whole load of veterans in a town called Puddletown, where we would go to a church, and they would have, this would be on a Sunday afternoon, we often paraded in the morning as well for something else, so that these veterans could remember their fallen colleagues, but also what it was that we were remembering. And the poppy was a sign of that act of remembrance, a sign of those that had given their lives, but actually a sign of the fact that we had freedom. And when I was growing up, and this is the kind of sign of getting old and like not wanting things to change, that you generally wore a poppy for the couple of weeks leading up to Remembrance Sunday or the 11th of November. And over recent years, it seems to me that the poppy has now become an all-pervasive sign that is all year round. And you see it on vans and cars, and people wear it a lot more than they ever did. And actually, the sign of what it was there to remind us of, and to remind that actually we should be fighting for peace, and we don't want to have another war. We're really grateful for the people that have allowed us to be free, but we don't want to have another war. And don't get me wrong, I'm not dismissing remembrance. I think it's really significant that we remember those who serve our country, who've paid the ultimate price or have been injured. But actually, it's moved on from that. And I think instead of remembering why people fought and that we don't want to have another war, it's become this kind of strange nationalistic symbol, and it's been detached from what it was originally about. The other thing that really winds me up is when you go to a concert and everybody just holds their phone up the whole time. And so a couple of weeks ago, I've actually been to two concerts with Emily in recent weeks. We went to see Anne-Marie at the Motor Point. Who knew I was an Anne-Marie fan? And what was so funny is as soon as she came out, you literally could not see the stage because there was just a bank of phones just above head height. You couldn't see anything that was going on. And then last weekend, we went to see Ed Sheeran, and this took the biscuit for me. But going back to the root of this is a few years ago, well, a lot of years ago now, nearly 20 years ago. I remember the first time it happened, and I was somewhere abroad. We saw this incredible piece of theatre, and there was one person there who had this tiny little digital camera. This was before smartphones, where you had this really, really rubbishy kind of 1-inch screen on the back. And we were at this thing that was kind of world-renowned kind of theatre, and this guy never ever took his eyes off this 1-inch terrible pixelated screen. You're at this world famous thing and you have not for one moment looked at it. And it really made me kind of think, no, if I go to stuff like that, I'm actually going to make the most of going to that and use my own eyes to look at it and concentrate on what's going on. And yes, you might want to take a picture to remind you, or these days you might want to take a bit of video. But actually, if you spend the whole time watching the screen, you miss the thing. Now, what happened to Ed Sheeran, which was truly amazing, was the guy in front of us, if you've seen pictures of the Ed Sheeran thing in the Principality Stadium, he was in the middle of the pitch, and he had like these big screens all around that were in the shape of plectrums. And this guy sat in the row in front of us, had his phone pointing at the screen of Ed Sheeran. Ed Sheeran's over here. He's pointing at the screen, and he's watching his screen of another screen of this guy that's over there for about an hour and a half. And you're just like, what are you doing? You're in this place, come to see this guy, and you're watching a screen of the person. Now, there is a link between that and what we're talking about today, which I'll try to make. But if we've got Amos 5, have we got Amos 5 on the screen? Yeah, 1 to 13. So we'll read these few verses. Hear this word, O house of Israel. This lament I take up concerning you. Fallen is virgin Israel, never to rise again, deserted in her own land, with no one to lift her up. This is what the sovereign Lord says. The city that marches out 1,000 strong for Israel will have only 100 left. The town that marches out 100 strong will have only 10 left. This is what the Lord says to the house of Israel. Seek me and live. Do not seek Bethel. Do not go to Gilgal. Do not journey to Beersheba. For Gilgal will surely go into exile, and Bethel will be reduced to nothing. Seek the Lord and live, or he will sweep through the house of Joseph like a fire. It will devour, and Bethel will have no one to quench it. You who turn justice into bitterness and cast righteousness to the ground, he who made the Pleiades and Orion, who turns blackness into dawn and darkens day into night, who calls for the waters of the sea and pours them out over the face of the land. The Lord is his name. He flashes destruction on the stronghold and brings the fortified city to ruin. You hate the one who reproves in court and despise him who tells the truth. You trample on the poor and force him to give you grain. Therefore, though you have built stone mansions, you will not live in them. Though you have planted lush vineyards, you will not drink their wine. For I know how many are your offenses and how great your sins. You oppress the righteous and take bribes, and you deprive the poor of justice in the courts. Therefore, the prudent man keeps quiet in such times, for the times are evil. We're going to focus on one verse, the end of verse 4 and beginning of verse 5, and it says, Seek me and live, do not seek Bethel. There's a particular challenge in this passage about how we approach worship, in essence, how we approach coming to church, how we determine what is important, and particularly with our traditions, whether we can actually miss the point if we're not careful. We can make the wrong thing, those things that are actually the frills around the edges, the focus instead of God. And the heart of this chapter relates to 3 pilgrimages that the Israelites would make to 3 different important places. It's mentioned there, Bethel, Gilgal, and Beersheba. It says, do not seek Bethel, do not go to Gilgal, do not journey to Beersheba. So in these ancient times, they would have made a pilgrimage, probably annually, to these 3 locations. And if you did it all in one go, it would be about a 150-mile round trip. Now, I don't know, haven't been able to find out whether they would go on one long pilgrimage every year, and you can imagine they're going on foot, or whether they would go to one and then go to another and then go to the other. And Beersheba was actually in the south of Judah. If you recall back to earlier weeks, we've got this nation of the 12 tribes split into two. Amos has gone to the north, to Israel, to give this message, and they would have gone to Beersheba in the south, far in the south, as one of these three pilgrimages. And why is it that they went to those places? Why did they make significant journeys? Well, these three locations were hallowed because of their association with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. They're significant ancestors, and they had been places where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had had significant encounter with God. Now, I'm going to focus today on just one of them, and that's Bethel, as the second half of this chapter picks up on the message around the other two, and Marv is going to be preaching on that next week. So when we think about Bethel, that is an important location for Jacob. And there's two passages in Genesis around where Jacob was at Bethel and when he encountered God. Now, I'm not going to read them out, but I will paraphrase them, and they may remind you. I'm sure you will remember some of it. So the first is in Genesis chapter 28, and Jacob arrived at this place, Bethel, on his way to somewhere else. It wasn't even a place at that time. He was journeying. So if you remember, Jacob was the brother of Esau, and he stole the blessing from his brother. So he had just tricked his father Isaac into blessing him, and Esau had found out. So he was running from his brother, but his father said, go to this place called Padan Aram, where you can try to find a wife. And you might remember he goes to stay with his uncle called Laban, and he ends up marrying his daughters. And there's that whole story. But so he's on the way to this place, but he's scared. He's running away from his brother. He doesn't really know what is going to happen, but he's had this blessing. And he stops at this place, which becomes Bethel, where he has a dream. Now, the most important or amazing thing for me that stands out is he uses a stone for a pillow. Now, anyone who uses a stone for a pillow and sleeps well enough to have a dream, fair play, that must be God as far as I'm concerned. But he sleeps and he has this dream where he sees a staircase or a ladder between heaven and earth, and there are angels moving up and down between heaven and earth. But what's interesting is that staircase and ladder is not for Jacob to go up into heaven, but it's for God to reach down and speak to Jacob. And so he wakes up, and Jacob says, and this is in the passage, God is surely in this place. And he then takes the stone that he's been using as a pillow and he stands it upright to mark this place, Bethel. And that is the origin of this place, Bethel. And what's significant is then he awoke transformed for the task that was set before him. And in that passage, it talks about how he was totally convinced that God was with him, was watching over him as a result of this encounter. So that's the first episode where Jacob encounters God at Bethel and he leaves a different person to the one that arrived. The second time is in chapter 35, verses 1 to 14. And Jacob is instructed by God to return to Bethel and to go and build an altar. So he then in turn instructs his household to purify themselves, to get rid of any foreign gods they had with them and to go. And maybe it's that kind of return and that journey that has been the essence of this pilgrimage and making the journey to Bethel that Jacob himself made. But what's telling is that when Jacob gets to Bethel again, he has another encounter with God. And God says, your name is Jacob, but you will no longer be called Jacob. Your name will be Israel. And he then gave Israel a promise. I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and increase in number. A nation and community of nations will come from you, and kings will come from your body. The land I gave to Abraham and Isaac I also give to you, and I will give this land to your descendants after you. So you can see why this is a significant site for the nation of Israel. It's where they were named and given the promise. It's a place of origin for them. But the real reason it's significant is because God met with Jacob, and again, Jacob left changed. What changed Jacob was not actually the place, but the encounter with God. And most important was the change that then happened in Jacob. He was given a future, an assurance, a promise, and he then lived differently as a result. Motya, the commentator that a number of us have referenced as we've been going through this book, said there was a renewing, reorientating power. So then we can reread the words of Amos and see what he is telling the people. He says, "Seek me and live, do not seek Bethel." There was something going on with the Bethel seeking, this pilgrimage, the religion that they were enacting that was missing the point. Amos is telling them, seek God. That's what it was all about. That is what Bethel was supposed to be a reminder of. The reason you went there was to think what happened here and then reenact that, to seek God for encounter. But something had got lost. They were now just seeking Bethel and not grasping what it was really about. And as I said, with those examples at the beginning, you can miss the point. The same with the way the poppy, over time, you forget what it was about and it takes on some kind of weird second meaning. And I think it's the same with many, many traditions. And over time, they were really, really well intended, but they've missed the point. And I think one of the other ones, particularly in churches not of our tradition, is liturgy. So my wife grew up going to Catholic church, and she finds liturgy a real turn-off. As soon as you go to any church that uses that kind of formal language, she finds it really hard. Now, when I go, and I've never really grown up in a church, read the words, and you're like, wow, these words are amazing, what they're pointing to. But so often that's lost. Kind of you have someone just reciting it with less interest than you could possibly muster if you tried. But when those words were written, you can see how significant they were and what they were trying to point the reader and the hearer to. But over time, we forget that and they just get recited with no depth and no understanding, and we're not really pointing to what they are. And there are so many traditions like that. And I think what we have to be really aware of is how our own traditions, we might not think they're traditions, we might think they're really modern, and trust me, most of them aren't anymore. Maybe they were once, but do we see what their reason is, or do we get distracted by the sideshow? The actual point at the heart of this is, are they a tool to seek God, to point us to God, or not? So then verses 6 to 13 of this passage go into a bit more detail into the issues God is pointing out through Amos in relation to Bethel. And it picks up on the theme of God as a transformer, the fact that Jacob was transformed at Bethel. And so there were a couple of verses, they're in brackets in my Bible, I don't know if they were in brackets when they showed up on the screen, verses 8 to 9. And it talked about he who made the Pleiades and Orion, who turns blackness into dawn and darkness day into night, who calls the waters of the sea and pours them out over the face of the land. The Lord is his name. He flashes destruction on the stronghold and brings the fortified city to ruin. And apparently this is essentially, it's like a hymn of worship to God, of how he is the God who oversees change. So when it talks about Pleiades and Orion, it's talking about the constellations that in ancient times were significant indicators of the changing seasons. So it's talking about God as the God who oversees the changing seasons through the year. It then talks about night into day, into night, and how God is overseeing the changes from day to day to day. So we've got this kind of big landscape, seasonal changes, then we've got the day-to-day changes, and then it talks about these floods when the land is inundated with water, and wars. So these kind of occasional happenings that, again, God is overseeing. And the commentators say that actually the way that Amos structures this is really clever. He starts this paragraph with criticizing the Israelites, saying, "You who turn justice into bitterness and cast righteousness to the ground." So they're not living the way God has wanted them to live. And previous weeks we've talked about this whole message of justice. Then he sets into context this kind of, you then go to this place, you sing these songs of worship about this God who's overseeing change, this transforming God at this place where Jacob encountered God and left transformed. And then he ends the paragraph with, "You hate the one who reproves in court and despise him who tells the truth. You trample on the poor, force him to give you grain." You've arrived sinful, you've sung all these songs of worship to this transforming God, and you've left just the way you arrived. And it's not the promises of Bethel, nor the promises of God that are failing, but it's a willful resistance to change from their wrong ways of living, a religion that left their lives untouched and unchanged. And that is what Amos is criticizing. So they might well journey and sing and go through all the motions of their traditions and their religion, and they genuinely thought they were worshipping, but when they come away, they live exactly the same as they did before. They continue to mete out injustice. They're not pursuing righteousness. What they're actually pursuing are these bribes and extortion and enriching themselves. Now, it's important to remember, and we make this reminder regularly, righteous living isn't something we do to impress God, to earn his favour. Not at all. What this passage is reminding us is that it flows out of encounter. It's the primary evidence for having had that encounter. Where there is no change, we need to examine, why is this? Do we come away wanting to live according to God's will, tackling injustice? Does it affect the way we are with other people, that we no longer mistreat the poor? And that might not be, mistreating the person down there. It's the choices we make about the way we spend our money in this modern world. Do we seek a life of, acquisition and enriching ourselves, or live a life of service? And we can look at Jesus at that model of what it is to be a servant and to live a life transformed. So Amos is calling out their lack of concern for sin. If they were aware of it, they would want to do something about it. If they'd encountered God, you wouldn't leave wanting to go on sinning. You would want to go and live according to God's law, to do something about it. And it's not to say that we should then go away from church and we're going to live this perfect life, far from it. But sin in our lives should be a concern as we become aware of it. And God, in his grace, doesn't bring everything to the surface at once. But as and when we become aware of sin, do we want to deal with it, or have we become numb to it? And are we going along to church and going through all the rituals, but not wanting God to come close, not wanting God to change us, not wanting an encounter that means that we're going to let God in? You will know in your own heart and mind how that sits with you. So Jacob at Bethel reminds us of a God who speaks. And when he speaks life. Seek the Lord and live. So what is significant for us today as the church, as it was for the hearers of Amos's word at the time, is that, as I said, the listeners were firmly of the view that they were sharers of the promises of God. They were part of the nation of Israel. They were part of the chosen people. So these words were a sharp challenge to them. That is one thing to know what the promise is, but it's another altogether to be an inheritor of it. They believed they were sharing in the promises of Bethel, that God is with them. But what Amos is saying is they weren't true pilgrims. Essentially, they were just going on a jolly. They were going on a church day out. It was a social club and not a church. And God is clearly not impressed. In keeping with the other passages, we get this warning of a coming judgment, of a rebuke from God, of fire, the ultimate sign of divine rejection. And pointing out at that moment that their religion, the line was, and Bethel will have no one to quench it. Their religion is going to be of no help whatsoever at the point of judgment. And it reminded me of Matthew chapter 7, verses 21 to 23, when there's these people who say, well, I knew you. I was prophesying in your name. We were casting out demons. But Jesus says, I never knew you. There's no credible relationship with God or evidence of a life transformed by obedience to the will of the Father as a result. So it's a stark warning against religion that's big on display and low on genuine encounter and renewal. And I don't mean in the moment experiences, but real change in the way we treat people and live our lives. Paul, again, talks about the renewing of our minds. We need to go through this process of sanctification and change. And don't think I'm standing here as someone who's got this nailed. Every time you stand up here to preach, you find it examines you at least as sharply as anybody who's sitting out there, because it's a challenge to look inside ourselves, but we have an opportunity to put things right if they're not right. And the challenge is to seek Jesus. We're not just left floundering. It's not then about struggling and striving. So it's not a condemning word for us. But there is a challenge that we need to open our hearts to him. Are we open to being transformed? Do we have evidence in our lives of being transformed? Is it evident in our attitudes to justice and to the poor that we have encountered God and we are changed by it? So Amos is saying, instead of setting time aside to go to Bethel, set time aside to go to God. Organize your life around that. If you've got the time and effort to organize to go on this pilgrimage, redirect that. Don't miss the point and focus on the wrong thing. Don't focus on the imitation or the sideshow or what it's become, because it's a distraction. It's seeking the Lord that is the way of life. So just to kind of wrap that up, what does that mean for us? Well, we mustn't worship. I think there's a risk for that in some sections of the church. We mustn't worship the past. There might be things in the past that can point us and remind us of what God's done, but we shouldn't just celebrate them. We should use those to remind us, what do they point to, and pursue that. We must worship God. Bethel was the place where God transformed Jacob on 2 occasions. The lesson from that is that God transforms us when we meet with him. Do we come open to be transformed? Do we live our lives in a way that creates the opportunity to go on being transformed? Do we exhibit the evidence of having been, or more accurately, of being transformed? And there's different ways that can happen. So we think about the first Pentecost. There was this powerful manifestation of the Spirit as the disciples gathered in prayer. They went out changed. But it was preceded by that time seeking God, waiting on him, and the Spirit fell and they changed. But it might actually be through outworking some of that change. From actually the encounters of serving the poor and the broken. God doesn't want our worship to just be singing in church. And we've talked about this as we've been going through this series. But actually, it's through that encounter that God can change our hearts, that we can see his love for people, that we can see what his priorities are. So the challenge for us today is, are we being transformed? Are we open to being transformed? And are we seeking God at the heart of it? So we're going to just have a time of response. I'm going to hand over to Annabelle, but an opportunity to be open, to recommit. As I said, I don't want this to be condemning, because it's not the final word for us. There are opportunities in the way that Amos was bringing a rebuke to Israel of coming judgment. But we have Jesus. We're in a different position. We have the cross. So there's an opportunity for us to examine ourselves, and where we know there is something wrong, to confess and to repent. And on this day when we mark Pentecost, to be open to a new filling of the Spirit, a new encounter, to truly seek God, and to be open to be transformed.